The kitchen buzzed with the familiar morning noises, the clatter of dishes, the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker, and the soft sizzle of pancakes on the stove. It was a routine so well-worn it felt almost stifling. Richard sat at the table, a newspaper spread in front of him, though his mind was elsewhere. He turned the pages absent-mindedly, pretending to read, but the quiet between him, Abigail, and their daughter Victoria pressed heavily on him. Abigail was buttering toast in the background, but the warmth she used to bring to the room had long since faded away. "Are you heading to the office today?" Abigail asked while flipping a pancake, not even glancing his way. Her voice was flat, stripped of the tenderness that once filled even their simplest conversations. Richard peered over the top of the newspaper, catching sight of her out of the corner of his eye. She moved mechanically, speaking to him as if he were a stranger, the connection they once shared seemingly a thing of the past. They lived together, but it was more like they just inhabited the same space rather than living a life together. "Yes, I have meetings. I should be back by 5, he replied, trying to keep his tone steady. Abigail nodded without turning around, offering no words of encouragement, just the cold silence that had grown between them. Richard watched her for a few moments longer, noting the tension in her movements and how she avoided his gaze. Something had shifted between them long ago, but neither of them seemed willing or able to discuss it. He sighed and sipped his coffee, realizing it had already gone cold. Across the table, Victoria was glued to her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen with a focus she rarely showed for anything else. She didn't even glance up when Abigail placed a plate of pancakes in front of her. "How's school going?" Victoria, Richard asked, attempting to break through the emotional wall she had erected around herself. "Fine," she muttered without lifting her eyes, the same distant response he always got. No details, no conversation. He no longer knew what she enjoyed, who her friends were, or what her plans were after graduation. The once lively talks they shared had dwindled to silence, and he felt like a stranger in his own home. He drew a deep breath, pushing down his frustration. This was his daughter, the little girl who used to rush to greet him after work, snuggle next to him on the couch, and laugh at cartoons. Now she barely acknowledged him. "Anything interesting happening at school?" he tried again, hoping for any response. Victoria sighed, as if talking was too much of an effort. No, a knot tightened in his stomach, but he didn't press further. What was the point? Every attempt to engage her felt futile. He glanced at Abigail, still at the stove, her back turned to him. She'd overheard their brief interaction but said nothing, didn't attempt to help like she used to bridge the gap between him and Victoria. It seemed as though she no longer cared. He wanted to ask her, to figure out what had gone wrong between them, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say when he didn't even know the cause? All he knew was that his family was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Eventually, Abigail joined them at the table with her own plate, her focus entirely on her food. Richard searched her face, looking for any sign, anything to show that they were still connected, even in the smallest way. "What are your plans for today?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Abigail shrugged while cutting her pancake. "Nothing special, just a few errands. Might stop by my mom's." It was the same response she gave almost every day. She used to share everything with him, her thoughts, her plans, her excitement, but now it seemed she had a life of her own, one that no longer included him. "You've been going to your mom's a lot lately," Richard observed, attempting to keep the tension out of his voice, though it was clear. Abigail paused mid-bite, finally meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like ages. Richard couldn't shake the image of that moment, how her gaze had turned distant, as if she'd closed a door between them. "She's just been under the weather lately, you know how it gets," Abigail replied casually, but something about her words didn't sit right with him. He sensed something hidden, though it wasn't overt. "Yes, she's been visiting her mother, but not as often as she claimed. There were too many late returns, too many vague explanations. Maybe we could have dinner together tonight, just the two of us," he suggested, hoping to recapture some of the intimacy they had lost. Abigail's expression remained blank. "Maybe if I'm back in time," her words, which used to be filled with warmth, now sounded like excuses. Richard stared down at his plate, his appetite disappearing. Across the room, Victoria suddenly stood up, phone in hand. "I'm going to Katie's after school. I won't be home for dinner," she announced flatly, already walking out the door before they could respond. Richard watched her leave, the soft click of the bedroom door echoing in his mind. He sat there in the growing silence, a wife who barely spoke to him, and a daughter who acted like he didn't exist. The love that had once filled their home was now replaced by an icy distance he couldn't ignore. He glanced at Abigail, still staring at her phone, her breakfast untouched. The chasm between them felt impossible to bridge, widening with every passing moment. Despite his efforts, he couldn't figure out how to close the gap. For weeks now, a suffocating suspicion had been building inside him, as if something was happening that he couldn't fully grasp. Something hidden from him, maybe a secret, or a lie that explained why everything was unraveling so fast. But every time he tried to understand it, the answers slipped away, leaving him even more confused and angry. The sudden ringing of Abigail's phone snapped him out of his thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable, then stood abruptly. "I've got a busy day." "See you tonight," she muttered, leaving before Richard could say anything. The door clicked shut behind her, and once again Richard was left alone in the kitchen, the silence enveloping him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He stared at the table, his eyes fixed on the untouched plates of food, feeling the emptiness within him expand. Something was terribly wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but deep down he knew his family was slipping away, and he had no idea how to stop it. Later that night, Richard paced outside Victoria's room, frustration building inside him. Dinner with Abigail had been another strained, hollow conversation. Victoria didn't join them, claiming she had homework. After dinner, Abigail retreated to their bedroom with her phone, while Richard tried to lose himself in the TV, but the unease wouldn't leave him. The cold distance between them had grown unbearable. As he walked past Victoria's door, he paused, hearing faint voices. She often talked on the phone, but this time something felt off. He moved closer, straining to listen. The whispers grew clearer, though the words remained indistinct, but the tone unsettled him. Curiosity drew him in, even though he knew eavesdropping was wrong. Holding his breath, he pressed his ear to the door, and then he heard it. "I want everyone to know that Uncle Daniel is my real father, not that loser Richard." He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, unable to process what he had just heard. Uncle Daniel? His brother Daniel? Her real father? Inside the room, Victoria's voice cut through the air, sharp and decisive. "I'm tired of pretending, Mum. I want him out of my life." Richard's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out his thoughts, each beat thudding in his chest like a drum. The words repeated in his head, refusing to make sense. His daughter, his own flesh and blood, had called him a failure and dismissed him as if he meant nothing. But the most crushing blow followed immediately. She had called Daniel her real father. Before the full weight of her words could settle, another voice pierced through his shock, leaving him utterly disoriented. It was Abigail. His wife spoke softly, almost conspiratorially, to their daughter. "I know, sweetheart, just a little longer," she murmured. "Once the house and the business are in my name, everything will be ours. Then we'll get rid of him." The ease with which she uttered those words made Richard feel weak in the knees. He clung to the doorframe, his body trembling as the horrifying reality sank in. The woman he had spent 33 years with, his partner, was plotting against him. Worse, their daughter was a willing accomplice, helping to erase him from their lives. This wasn't just an affair, it was a carefully crafted betrayal, designed to rob him of everything he had worked for. The weight of this realization bore down on him, suffocating him. He stood frozen, his breathing shallow, gripping the doorframe as if it were his last connection to reality. A part of him wanted to storm in, confront them, demand answers, shout. But something inside held him back. A cold, rational voice warned him that if he confronted them now, they'd deny everything and cover their tracks. He needed to be smart, he needed evidence. Through his fog of disbelief, Victoria's voice cut through again, this time even sharper. "Why not just get rid of him now? He's too weak to fight back." Her words twisted Richard's stomach, sending a wave of nausea through him. Abigail's light laugh followed, a sound that now made his skin crawl. "We can't rush," she replied, her voice dripping with smugness. "We need to make sure everything is legally ours first. After that, he'll have nowhere to go. Trust me, it's worth the wait." Richard stumbled back from the door, feeling the bile rise in his throat. The urge to confront them was overwhelming, but he forced himself to walk away. They couldn't know he had overheard everything, not yet. He needed time to think, to plan his next steps. Their voices echoed in his mind as he walked down the hall, the rejection from his daughter, the plot from his wife. A deep, unfamiliar pain seized his chest. When he reached the kitchen, he leaned heavily against the counter, his thoughts racing. His brother Daniel, his own flesh and blood, had betrayed him too. The charming golden boy had seduced his wife. And Victoria, was she even his daughter? Had his entire life been a lie? Memories of the past crashed over him in waves. The late nights when Abigail said she was out for work, her growing coldness, the increasing distance with Victoria. He had written it off as the natural drift of a long marriage, the rebellion of a teenager. But now the cruel truth stood before him. They had been planning this for years, biding their time, while he remained blissfully ignorant. His fists clenched, fury and betrayal burning inside him. He wanted to scream, to smash something, but he knew losing control now wasn't an option. Mechanically, he opened the fridge, staring blankly at its contents, seeing nothing as his mind raced ahead. He couldn't confront them now. He needed undeniable proof, a DNA test for Victoria, evidence of Abigail's affair. He had to uncover just how deep their betrayal went. Closing the fridge, Richard leaned against the counter, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. His life had crumbled, but he wasn't about to let them see him break. Not yet. He would gather the evidence, and when the moment was right, he would strike, exposing them for the liars they truly were. An unbearable weight settled over him, the harsh truth wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. The life he had once believed was his marriage. His family had been nothing more than a fragile illusion, riddled with lies that had infiltrated every part of what he once held sacred. The house was eerily silent. The faint sounds from Victoria's room had ceased, leaving only the occasional creak of the floorboards above, where Abigail was likely getting ready for bed. She had no idea that Richard's world had just crumbled beneath him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and headed for the stairs. He had to keep up appearances, at least for the time being. If Abigail caught even the smallest hint of his suspicion, she might change her behavior, and Richard couldn't let that happen, not with so much now at stake. Each step he took intensified the question gnawing at him. How long had this been going on? How long had he been living a lie, convinced his family was solid when it had already fallen apart? When he reached the bedroom, Abigail was already in bed, her back turned to him. The soft glow of her phone illuminated her face as she scrolled through her feed, paying no attention to him. She didn't acknowledge his presence when he entered, and no words passed between them. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, turning his back to her, his hands shaking slightly as he removed his shoes, his movements mechanical, as if his mind were somewhere far away. His thoughts whirled in chaotic loops, but he forced himself to stay composed. He needed time to think, to plan. This wasn't over. He couldn't let them walk away unscathed. Lying beside her, he felt an immense distance between them, a gap that felt impossible to cross. The woman beside him was no longer the person he once knew. She had become a stranger, a partner in the betrayal that had destroyed his life. Yet he remained silent. Without a word, Abigail turned off her phone, placed it on the nightstand, and pulled the blanket over herself, oblivious to the storm raging inside Richard. He stared at the ceiling, his mind already piecing together a plan, and when the moment was right, he would strike. The following week, Richard moved through his daily routine with a calm, calculated demeanor, hiding the fury that burned within him. Every action was precise, betraying no sign of the anger boiling beneath the surface. He kissed Abigail goodbye each morning as though nothing had changed, though each kiss felt like slow poison eating away at him. He was simply waiting, counting the days until he could make his move. Confronting Abigail or his brother too soon would give them the chance to twist the truth, to wriggle out of what they'd done. That was something he couldn't allow. He needed solid proof, evidence they couldn't deny or manipulate. So he turned to George Smith, a private investigator known for his discretion and skill at uncovering dark secrets. "I need to know if my wife is seeing someone else," Richard told him when they met in a dimly lit cafe across town. "And not just anyone, my brother." George listened intently, his face neutral but understanding. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once we start, there's no going back." Richard didn't hesitate. His voice was steady, though inside he felt anything but. "I'm sure. I need the truth, and I need evidence." George began following Abigail with meticulous care, giving her no reason to suspect she was being watched. The first few days revealed nothing unusual. She stuck to her routine errands, yoga, and visits to Richard's mother. But on the fourth day, everything changed. George sent Richard a photo that shattered any lingering doubts. It was a picture of Abigail holding hands with Daniel, entering a hotel. Seeing the image on his phone felt like a punch to the gut. There they were, his wife and his brother walking into a hotel, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. All the excuses, the late nights, they had all been lies. Daniel, his own brother, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Richard's hands shook as he stared at the photo, but he kept his emotions in check. Not yet. He forwarded the image to his lawyer, knowing the next phase of his plan had begun. But this wasn't the end, there was more. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. He needed undeniable proof to confront Abigail and Daniel, something they couldn't deny or twist into another lie. The next step involved Victoria, and the thought of it made him sick. The possibility that the daughter he had loved for nearly 22 years wasn't his gnawed at him, but he had to know for sure. Without letting Abigail or Victoria suspect anything, he took a sample from her toothbrush and sent it for a DNA test. 2 days later, the results came in. Richard sat in his car, the weight of fear pressing down on him as he opened the envelope. The world around him blurred as he read the words confirming his worst nightmare. Victoria wasn't his biological child. The report was cold and clinical, but it felt like a knife to the heart. There was no biological connection between him and the girl he had cherished. The very foundation of his life had been built on lies he never saw coming. His heart shattered as he faced the brutal reality of his situation. Betrayal and disappointment crashed over him as he realized that everything he had thought was his had been a cruel illusion. But Richard wasn't going to drown in sorrow. Instead, he clung to his rage, a white, hot anger that burned through him. Abigail had deceived him for over 2 decades, making him believe Victoria was his while she carried on her affair with Daniel. She had used him, manipulated him, and was now plotting to take everything from him. But Richard wasn't going to let her win. Slowly, a cold, calculated plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't just going to expose their betrayal, he intended to destroy them. His first step was to call his lawyer. He needed to ensure that the divorce would leave Abigail with nothing. "I want everything locked down," he said firmly during the call. "The house, the business, she gets nothing mere." His sharp-tongued lawyer didn't hesitate. "Understood," she replied, "but you'll need to keep up appearances until everything is finalized." "But I can manage," Richard responded confidently. And he did. Each morning he smiled at Abigail, kissed her on the cheek, and played the part of the unsuspecting husband. He ignored her frequent messages, pretended not to notice her increasingly regular business trips. Outwardly he remained calm, while George quietly gathered every bit of evidence. Richard needed everything to be flawless: photos, dates, even recorded conversations. George didn't disappoint. He tracked Abigail's every move, capturing photos every time she visited Daniel's apartment. He even recorded an incriminating conversation between them. Their voices echoed ominously in the quiet night. One late evening, Richard sat alone in his office, listening to the recording. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the desk, Abigail's smug voice filling the room. "Once I get the house and the business, we'll be together," she said, satisfaction clear in her tone. He has no clue. By the time he realizes it'll be too late, Daniel's voice followed, smooth and content. "You've always been clever, Abigail." "I can't wait for the 3 of us to be together." Richard's jaw clenched. A tremor ran through his body, but he held back. It wasn't the right moment to act. When everything was set, Richard launched the final phase of his plan. He arranged a family trip, something they hadn't done in years, presenting it as a surprise for Victoria's birthday. Neither Abigail nor Victoria suspected anything. It was Victoria's 22nd birthday, and an unspoken tension lingered in the house. Abigail hummed cheerfully as she set the table for their small family dinner, practically glowing with excitement. Richard understood why she believed this year marked the start of her new life. Victoria sat curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up with a smile, thinking about what the day might bring. Richard quietly watched them both from the table, though his mind was far ahead, anticipating their imminent downfall. Every glance, every smile, each casual interaction between Abigail and Victoria felt to Richard like a dagger, slowly twisting in his heart. Yet to them, he appeared as the perfect husband and father, hiding the storm within behind a calm mask. His plan was nearly complete, but he had to keep playing the part a little longer. "Hey, birthday girl," he called to Victoria, walking over with a warm smile that felt unnatural. "How about we do something different this year, maybe a spontaneous trip?" His tone was light and playful, hiding the dark motives beneath. Victoria's face lit up instantly as she exchanged an excited glance with Abigail. They had no idea what lay ahead. "A trip, Dad?" "Really?" she asked, finally setting her phone down. "Of course," Richard replied, forcing a strained smile. "We leave tomorrow. Pack light, everything's ready." Abigail, thrilled, hugged him unexpectedly, a rare gesture after weeks of distance. "This will be wonderful, darling, the three of us together again. Like old times," she said, her smile making Richard's insides churn. He fought the urge to pull away from her touch. She had no clue that her world was about to shatter. The next morning, Richard rose early. He packed the car, maintaining the facade of laughter and smiles as if nothing was wrong. Abigail, pleased with herself, believed she had everything under control. Even Victoria, who was usually distant, seemed excited about the trip. Every move Richard made was deliberate. Every bag he loaded into the car had its place in his plan. The luggage seemed perfect for a weekend getaway, but it was part of the deception. Abigail and Victoria thought they were headed to their favorite beach house, but Richard had a much darker destination in mind. As he shut the trunk, he took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what was to come. When Abigail and Victoria finally came downstairs, the car was ready. Richard greeted them with the same practiced smile he had worn for weeks. They got in, completely unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Abigail and Victoria were too engrossed in chatting about the vacation to notice anything amiss. "So, where are we going?" Abigail asked playfully from the passenger seat, casting him a curious glance. There was a glint in her eyes, whether from excitement or something more sinister, Richard couldn't tell. She thought she had won, convinced everything was falling into place for her. But Richard kept his eyes on the road, his voice calm and steady. "It's a surprise," he said simply. Abigail turned to Victoria with a knowing smirk. "I can't wait to see what your dad has planned," she remarked. Victoria smiled faintly, her attention still mostly on her phone, as usual. The drive continued in a serene rhythm, the gentle hum of the engine the only sound. But when Richard veered off the main highway and onto a familiar road, Abigail's expression shifted. She recognized the route. They weren't headed to the beach house. They were on the way to his mother's home. Her confusion was immediate. "Wait, why are we going this way?" she asked, the smile starting to fade from her face. "This isn't the road to the beach." Richard stayed silent as the tension in the air thickened. He could feel Abigail's anxiety growing as they neared his mother's house. When they finally arrived, where his brother Daniel also lived, Abigail's confusion turned to suspicion. She shot Richard a wary glance, her voice trembling. "Richard, what's happening?" Victoria, sensing something was off, looked up from her phone. "Yeah, Dad, what's going on?" Richard parked the car, his thoughts racing even as his expression remained blank. He turned to both of them, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You'll see," he said cryptically. "But first, there's something you need to look at." Before they could respond, he stepped out of the car, walked to the trunk, and retrieved a brown envelope and a suitcase. Abigail and Victoria exchanged uneasy glances. Not daring to get out of the car. "What's happening?" Victoria asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. This birthday was supposed to be a happy day, but nothing about it had hinted it would turn out like this. Richard returned to their side, holding the envelope in his hand. Without speaking, he handed it to Abigail. She hesitated, confusion flashing in her eyes, but eventually she opened it, her face drained of color as she read the contents. It was a DNA test. Her hands began to tremble as she flipped through the papers. "Richard, what is this?" she whispered, her voice shaky, fear now taking over her expression. Richard's reply was cold, steady, and merciless. "This," he said, "is exactly what you deserve." He turned to Victoria, feeling a tightening knot in his chest, though his voice remained controlled. "It's a DNA test," he said icily. "It proves you aren't my daughter." Victoria's eyes widened in shock, her face paling. "What? What do you mean, Dad?" she stammered, panic creeping into her voice. Richard stared at her, his gaze devoid of any remaining warmth. "Ask your gold-digging mother and your real father," he spat bitterly. "I'm done with this." Abigail's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents, her breathing becoming unsteady, nearly hyperventilating. "No, this can't be true. I can explain everything," she began, but Richard cut her off, his voice unnervingly calm. "Don't bother, Abigail. I've heard enough," he said, maintaining icy composure. "That night I overheard you and Victoria discussing your plan, how you'd kick me out once I signed over the house and the business. I've known about your affair for months." Tears welled up in Abigail's eyes, streaming down her cheeks as she reached out for him. "Richard, please forgive me. We can fix this. We can fix everything," she pleaded desperately. Richard let out a joyless, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "There's nothing left to fix, Abigail. You've been lying to me for 23 years, maybe longer. You used me, plotted behind my back. And all of it with my own brother." His expression grew harsher, his gaze dropping to the ground. "And now you think you're going to take everything from me," he said, his voice as hard as steel. Victoria sat frozen in the back seat, her face ashen, her hands gripping the seat tightly. "Dad, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this," she whispered. Richard looked at her with disappointment. "Maybe you didn't know everything, Victoria, but you knew enough. You called me a loser, and you wanted everyone to know that Daniel is your real father. Well, congratulations, now everyone knows." He pulled out another set of papers. "And this, Abigail," he said coldly, "is the divorce paperwork. It's already been filed. I'm done with both of you." "No," Abigail screamed, leaping out of the car and running toward him. She grabbed his arm, her eyes filled with desperation. "Richard, please. I made a mistake. I'll do anything, just don't leave us. Don't leave us. Don't leave me." Richard yanked his arm away forcefully, his face hard and distant, as if carved from stone. "You made your choices, Abigail. Now, live with them. Ask Daniel how he plans to take care of you, because I'm done." Richard tossed the stack of papers to the ground without a glance and walked swiftly back to his car. Behind him, Abigail's sobs echoed while Victoria remained motionless, unable to speak. Richard drove off without looking back, feeling a strange sense of peace. The burden of their betrayal had finally lifted, and for the first time in years he felt free. They had conspired against him, betrayed him in the worst way possible, but in the end they were the ones left broken and empty. Everything they tried to take from him, he had reclaimed. Richard left them with nothing but their guilt and each other's company. As the morning light streamed into his office, Richard sat at his desk, reviewing the final details of his plan. It had only been a few weeks since that pivotal day when he left them standing outside his mother's house like abandoned children, but in those few weeks, everything had changed. He acted quickly, contacting the right people, ensuring that neither Abigail nor Daniel would recover from the disaster they had caused. The first step was regaining control of his business. Armed with DNA test results and undeniable proof of their affair, Richard immediately contacted his lawyer and secured full control. Abigail, who once thought she could take everything from him, was now left with nothing. As Richard signed the last legal document, he muttered to himself, "She never knew what I was capable of when it came to protecting what was mine." His lawyer assured him that the DNA results were enough to void any claim Abigail might have for child support. She had hoped to use the system to her advantage, but now the court was fully on Richard's side. The judge, shocked by the extent of the betrayal, ruled in Richard's favor with ease. But courtroom victories weren't enough for him. Richard needed the truth about Abigail and Daniel to be known by everyone. He began by sharing details of their affair with mutual friends. Reactions ranged from disbelief to sympathy, but soon they shifted to disgust. The scandal spread quickly, and their once close-knit social circle turned its back on Abigail and Daniel. Richard didn't stop there. He sent copies of the DNA results to their families, colleagues, and even neighbors. Within days, their reputations were irreparably damaged. No one who had once respected them could look at them the same way again. One afternoon, while sipping coffee in his living room, Richard received yet another message. He glanced at his phone and saw Abigail's name. Her texts had been relentless over the past week, long, tearful apologies filled with regret and desperate pleas for forgiveness. He opened the latest one and read her words without any emotion. "Richard, please, I'm begging you. I'm so sorry for everything. I never meant for this to happen. I love you, and I know I've made terrible mistakes. I'll do anything to fix this. Please don't leave us like this. We were happy once. And I know we can be again. Please, at least for Victoria's sake." He stared at the message for a moment, his finger hovering over the screen, but his heart had grown cold. There was no forgiveness left in him. The memories of the night he overheard their betrayal still haunted him. Their plans to strip him of everything, to make him look like a fool, were fresh in his mind. Abigail's regret meant nothing to him now. Without a second thought, he deleted the message. That evening there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, Victoria stood there, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling. "Dad," she whispered, barely audible. "Can we talk? I swear I didn't know everything." Richard cut her off before she could continue, his voice calm but unyielding. "Victoria, I've had enough. I'm done with both of you." He had raised her, loved her, but the weight of the betrayal was too much to bear. "Is this fair after everything I sacrificed for you? You called me worthless and said you wished your uncle was your father." Victoria tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, unable to break through the heavy silence. "I owe you nothing," Richard said sharply, and before she could respond, he slammed the door in her face. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. Victoria remained standing at the doorstep, her sobs the only sound breaking the silence. Inside, Richard felt a familiar ache tighten in his chest, but he quickly buried it. There was no room for forgiveness. The wound her betrayal left was far too deep, too fresh to ever truly heal. While Richard battled his inner conflict, Daniel's life was falling apart, and Richard ensured that it did. By revealing Daniel's affair to his boss, a man who valued family above all else, he left no space for redemption. Within days, Daniel lost his job, his reputation crumbled, and the career he had built over the years was destroyed in an instant. He became a pariah, unable to secure work, and his financial stability dissolved before his eyes. Abigail wasn't faring much better. Without a job, without child support from Richard, and utterly isolated, she struggled to survive. The friends who had once been by her side vanished, leaving her in a house that no longer felt like a home. She kept telling herself that she could recover, that somehow she'd come out on top, but it was now painfully clear just how much she had lost, and the final blow was still coming. Richard wasn't content with simply exposing their affair. He wanted justice. He met with his lawyer, gathering irrefutable evidence to charge Abigail and Daniel with paternity fraud. The legal battle wore everyone down, but Richard was relentless. In court, Abigail and Daniel sat together, their faces pale as the damning evidence stacked up. The DNA test confirmed the truth, and the investigation into their affair left no doubt. The judge didn't hold back, condemning their actions as both morally wrong and legally criminal. The verdict was delivered in Richard's favor, and Abigail and Daniel were convicted of fraud. As they were led away in handcuffs, Richard watched from the back of the courtroom, his expression unreadable. Perhaps at one point he would have felt pity or regret, but those emotions were long gone. Now there was only satisfaction. They had deceived him, used him, and believed they could get away with it. But Richard made sure they paid for every lie, every betrayal. In the months after the trial, he found a peace he hadn't felt in years. He immersed himself in his work, expanding his business and rebuilding his life from the ruins of the past. He traveled, reconnected with old friends, and found comfort in the quiet simplicity of his new life. Now, everything was on his terms. As for Abigail and Daniel, their lives were in shambles. Prison stripped them of everything: friends, family, and their future. Their betrayal had cost them everything. Even Victoria had distanced herself from them. She had attempted to contact Richard seeking reconciliation, but their last encounter made it clear he would never forgive her. The choices she made were irreversible, and now she had to live with the consequences. Richard felt no remorse for his actions. He had done what was necessary to protect himself, his career, and his future. In the end, he had emerged victorious. 2 years had passed since Richard severed ties with Abigail and Victoria. 2 years since he stood on the driveway of her mother's house, watching their world crumble. He had witnessed their lives, built on deceit and lies, unravel completely. Now the wounds they inflicted on him were finally starting to heal. 3 months after the divorce, Richard sold the house. The memories inside its walls haunted him, the laughter that now felt hollow, the happiness that had been poisoned by betrayal. Staying there had become unbearable. He found a new home, smaller and simpler, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew him or his past. It was exactly what he needed: a fresh start. On his first night in the new house, Richard stood in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, gazing out at the unfamiliar streets. The silence surrounding him was soothing, a welcome escape from the chaos that had once filled his life. No more whispers, no more rumors, only peace. He no longer had to fake smiles or pretend to love a woman who had long stopped caring for him. The tension that had once defined every interaction with Victoria was gone. In its place was a peaceful solitude. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Setting down his glass, Richard cautiously approached and opened it to find someone he hadn't seen in years: Margaret, an old friend from his university days. After graduation, they had lost touch, only crossing paths briefly at a recent business event. Seeing her now brought a genuine smile to Richard's face. something he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. "I thought you might want some company on your first night here," Margaret said warmly, holding up a bottle of wine. Still smiling, Richard stepped aside, inviting her in. "I'd appreciate that," he admitted, closing the door behind her. They moved to the couch, quickly falling into an easy conversation, reminiscing about their university days and catching up on the time that had passed. Margaret knew about his divorce but never pressed for details she didn't need to. She had a unique ability to understand the pain of betrayal without asking questions. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, without pressure or expectations, just two old friends sharing an evening without the need for explanations. As the night wore on, Richard began to feel something he hadn't in a long time: warmth, a sense of comfort that had nothing to do with the wine. It was the realization that life was moving forward. Margaret wasn't Abigail. She expected nothing from him other than his company. For the first time in years, Richard wondered if he could let someone into his life again. Time passed, and what had begun as a simple reconnection developed into something much deeper. Margaret was unlike anyone Richard had ever known: honest, compassionate, and supportive in ways he hadn't even realized he needed. She never pushed him to talk about the past, allowing him to open up at his own pace. Gradually, Richard began to share everything: the pain, the betrayal, the anger that had once consumed him. Margaret listened patiently, without judgment, always understanding. One evening, after a quiet meal, they sat together on the porch of their new house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you ever think about them?" Margaret asked softly, her tone gentle. She had never brought up Abigail or Victoria before, knowing the wound still needed time to heal. Richard exhaled slowly, thinking carefully before responding. "Not like I used to," he replied quietly. "There was a time when it was all I could focus on: the betrayal, the anger. It consumed me." He paused, his gaze fixed on the fading light in the sky. "But now it's just memories." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Do you regret how it all ended?" Richard shook his head. "No, I did what I had to do. They made their choices, and I made mine. I don't regret anything." Meanwhile, Abigail and Daniel were struggling to face the fallout from their actions. After being released from prison, their lives were in shambles. The affair, the lie about Victoria's paternity, it had all destroyed them. Daniel had lost his career and reputation, and Abigail, once confident and manipulative, was now drowning in shame. Though they stayed together, their relationship had become an empty shell, void of passion and filled with only guilt and regret. Abigail, unable to move forward, was haunted daily by her choices. The weight of her mistakes consumed her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the image of how everything had crumbled. She longed for the life she had once shared with Richard, for the stability and security he had given her, but she knew that life was gone forever, and she had no one to blame but herself. As for Victoria, she had distanced herself from both her parents. Though she had once attempted to reconnect with Richard after the divorce, his decision to cut ties had been final. There was no going back. In time, Victoria came to understand why things had fallen apart the way they did. She had humiliated him, conspired with her mother to deceive him, and treated him with nothing but contempt. Now the weight of her actions, especially the cruel words she had once spoken, weighed heavily on her conscience. Living in isolation, Victoria felt lost, deprived of the support of her family, and struggled to find her identity and place in the world. Her past mistakes lingered like a persistent shadow, constantly reminding her of how she had driven her father away and lost the love she had once taken for granted. One day, Richard received a letter at his home. It was from Victoria. He stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity before finally gathering the courage to open it. The note inside was brief, the shakiness of her handwriting betraying the emotions behind each word. "Dad, I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I need to say how deeply sorry I am. I regret everything. I was naive and reckless. And I didn't realize what I was losing until it was too late. I hope you're well. I love you, even if we never speak again. Please forgive me. Victoria?" Richard read the letter twice, his heart torn by conflicting emotions. For a moment he considered replying, but in the end he carefully folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't ready yet. Maybe one day he would be, but that day wasn't today. Richard's life with Margaret was peaceful. Together they traveled to places Richard had always dreamed of visiting but had never had the chance to see. After selling his business, he took up consulting, which allowed him to work at his own pace and live more freely. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Margaret looked at him and smiled. "You look content," she said softly. Richard paused, reflecting for a moment, and realized she was right. After years of chaos and heartache, he had finally found real happiness. The bitterness, pain, and betrayal now felt like distant memories. He had been able to move forward, rebuild his life, and find someone who truly cared for him. "I am happy," Richard replied, gently squeezing Margaret's hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was truly at peace. With that realization, Richard let go of the past. The years of pain, betrayal, and sorrow were behind him, and only the future mattered now, a future filled with love, trust, and tranquility. As for those who had wronged him, they were left to live with the consequences of their actions. And this, my friend, is the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give a royal thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. May the Force be with you.